The Prime Minister looked like he enjoyed his trip. In fact, it looked like a dream come true for a man who was virtually a communist most of his life. Yeah. But apart from the... Before the Prime Minister even got on the plane, he'd already shown that he would do anything to demonstrate his good relationship with China. What we are criticising is his supine and short-termist approach. But his negotiating tactic has always been to give everything away in the hope that people will be nice to him in return. Mr. Speaker, apart from the Labubu doll in his suitcase, and I hope he's checked it for bugs, he has come back with next to nothing. We all want cheaper tariffs for Scottish whisky, but if the Prime Minister bothered to speak to the whisky industry like I did 2 weeks ago, he would know that what they really need is cheaper energy and lower taxes. What else did he get? Visa-free travel. China already offers this to other countries. It's not big enough for a prime ministerial visit. The worst thing was the Prime Minister claiming a glorious triumph with the lifting of sanctions on 4 Conservative MPs, as if he'd done us a favour. Let me tell him, those MPs were sanctioned because they stood up to China. They stood up against human rights abuses. They stood up against the country spying on our MPs in a way that he wouldn't dare. Those people don't want to go to China. The Chinese know that. They know that they are giving him something that costs absolutely nothing. Why can't the British Prime Minister see that? And I say to you, Mr. Speaker, and the whole House, like with the Chagos Islands, the Prime Minister has been played. Yeah. China is about to build an enormous spy hub in the centre of London, a ransom he had to pay before he could even get on the plane. I would never allow Britain to be held over a barrel like that. Yet the Prime Minister has negotiated our country into a weaker position in the world. His entire economic policy is to tax business more, regulate them harder, and make energy so expensive that we deindustrialize. And then we can import Chinese wind turbines, Chinese solar panels, Chinese batteries for electric vehicles, all manufactured in a country that is building a coal-fired power station every other week. It's no wonder, Mr. Speaker, that President Xi praised the Labour Party because the Conservatives stood up for Britain. We don't get pushed around.
Mr. Kyle, you said to me when you're going to China how well you will behave. Oh, you all be a big thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not worried about the business secretary. The entire business community thinks he's a joke and doesn't know what he's talking about. Of course we should engage with other countries, even hostile ones, but we need to do so with our eyes open and from a position of strength. And that requires a Prime Minister and a government that puts our national interest first. What did his trip achieve for Jimmy Lai? Nothing. Did China promise to stop fueling Putin's war machine in Ukraine? Doesn't sound like it. What did this trip achieve for the Uyghurs who are being enslaved? Absolutely nothing. Have China agreed to stop their relentless cyber attacks? Have they? We all know the answer to that. The reality is that China showed its strength and Britain was pushed around, literally.
Yesterday, at Prime Minister's Questions, Kemi Badenoch looked Keir Starmer in the eye and said something the BBC won't play on repeat. That The Guardian won't quote in their headlines. That Sky News will bury in their coverage. She called him what he is. That Prime Minister looked like he enjoyed his trip. In fact, it looked like a dream come true for a man who was virtually a communist most of his life. Virtually a communist. Not socialist, not left-wing. Communist. She said it in the House of Commons on live television, and you know what happened? Starmer had no answer. He couldn't defend himself. He couldn't deny it. Because it's true. And now, suddenly, everything about his China trip makes perfect sense. Why he approved that spy embassy before he even got on the plane. Why he smiled with Xi Jinping like they were old friends. Why he came back with absolutely nothing. This wasn't incompetence. This was ideological sympathy. Kemi started by destroying his entire approach. I am sure the Prime Minister means well, but his negotiating tactic has always been to give everything away in the hope that people will be nice to him in return. That's not diplomacy. That's weakness. Then she went further. Before the Prime Minister even got on the plane, he'd already shown that he would do anything to demonstrate his good relationship with China. He approved a 208-room Chinese mega embassy in central London, the biggest in Europe, despite security warnings, despite Kemi herself warning him not to. He gave China a spy hub as a down payment just to get the meeting with Xi. That's not normal behaviour, that's desperation, or something else. And then Kemi said the line that exposes everything. It looked like a dream come true for a man who was virtually a communist most of his life. Watch his face when she says it. He doesn't deny it, he just sits there. Because what can he say? His entire political career is public record. Let me take you through Keir Starmer's actual history because this isn't speculation. In the 1980s, Starmer was a member of the Haldane Society of Socialist Lawyers, not progressive lawyers, socialist lawyers. He edited their magazine. In the 1990s and 2000s, he represented trade unions in their most militant actions. He specifically chose hard left causes, radical unions, protesters against the establishment. He spent decades in socialist and communist circles. When he entered politics, he served in Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet. Jeremy Corbyn, a man who praised Hugo Chavez, who called Hamas and Hezbollah his friends, who attended rallies with communist flags, and Starmer stood by him, enabled him. He only turned on Corbyn when it became politically necessary to win an election. His entire career has been spent in far-left circles, advancing far-left causes, surrounded by people who openly sympathise with communist regimes. So when Kemi calls him virtually a communist, she's not being hyperbolic. She's reading his CV. Now look at his China trip through that lens. He meets Xi Jinping for 80 minutes, double the scheduled time. They're laughing together, signing cooperation agreements. Starmer looks genuinely happy. Why? Because ideologically, they're not that far apart. China is an authoritarian communist state. Starmer spent his entire life sympathising with socialist and communist movements. Of course he's comfortable with Xi. Of course he gave China what they wanted. Of course he came back with nothing, because getting something wasn't the point. The point was showing solidarity. Look at what Kemi listed as his achievements. Visa-free travel for British tourists. China already offers this to France, Germany, Spain. We're not special, we're just late. A whiskey tariff reduction from 10 to 5%. Kemi pointed out that if he'd spoken to the whiskey industry like she did, he'd know they need cheaper energy and lower taxes, not a tiny tariff cut. And then the most insulting one, lifting sanctions on 4 Conservative MPs. Kemi destroyed him on this. Let me tell him, those MPs were sanctioned because they stood up to China. They stood up against human rights abuses in a way that he wouldn't dare. Those MPs don't want to go to China. China knows that. They're giving Starmer something that costs nothing. And he's presenting it as a victory. It shows exactly where his sympathies lie. But here's what should terrify you. Kemi laid out what Starmer didn't achieve. What did this trip achieve for Jimmy Lai? Nothing. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen rotting in a Chinese prison for journalism. He's 76 years old. His health is failing. And Starmer spent 80 minutes with Xi and didn't secure his release. Didn't even get a commitment to improve his conditions. Nothing. Did China promise to stop fueling Putin's war machine in Ukraine? Doesn't sound like it. China is supplying Russia with technology being used to kill Ukrainians. Starmer didn't confront them. He smiled and signed agreements instead. What did this trip achieve for the Uyghurs who are being enslaved? Absolutely nothing. Over 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps, forced sterilisation, forced labour, genocide. And the British Prime Minister said nothing, did nothing. Because standing up for human rights would require confronting the Chinese Communist Party, and Starmer won't do that. Not because he's weak, though he is, but because ideologically he doesn't see them as the enemy. Subscribe right now, because what I'm about to tell you next is something the mainstream media will never admit. Kemi said, China is about to build an enormous spy hub in the centre of London, a ransom he had to pay before he could even get on the plane. Ransom, not approval, not agreement. Ransom. China told Starmer, "You want a meeting with Xi? Approve our embassy first." And he did it. He approved a 208-room intelligence facility in Britain's capital, despite security warnings, despite protests, despite obvious risks. He paid the ransom. For what? A photo op. Vague promises. A tiny tariff reduction. Nothing of substance. Kemi said it perfectly. I would never allow Britain to be held over a barrel like that. Yet again, the Prime Minister has negotiated our country into a weaker position in the world. Weaker. Every single international engagement Starmer has had has left Britain weaker. Chagos Islands handed over against British interests, creating a vulnerability China and Russia will exploit. The China trip, giving them a spy embassy for nothing meaningful. The relationship with Trump damaged because Starmer prioritised China over our closest ally. Pattern after pattern of weakness. Kemi connected it all. Like the Chagos Islands, the Prime Minister has been played. But this is different from being a weak negotiator. Weak negotiators are naive. They make mistakes. Starmer isn't making mistakes, he's making choices. Choices that favour authoritarian regimes over democratic allies. When Trump warned that the UK getting into business with China was very dangerous, a normal Prime Minister would pause, would reconsider. Starmer extended his trip, stayed in China an extra day, skipped Prime Minister's questions, sent David Lammy to face Parliament while he hid in Shanghai. That's not a mistake. That's choosing China over America. And when you understand his ideological background, his entire career in socialist and communist circles, it makes perfect sense. Kemi also exposed his economic policy. His entire economic policy is to tax business more, regulate them harder, and make energy so expensive that we deindustrialise, and then we can import Chinese wind turbines, Chinese solar panels, Chinese batteries, all manufactured in a country that is building a coal-fired power station every other week. Think about that model. Destroy British industry through taxation and regulation. Make energy impossible, then import everything from China. Who benefits? Not British workers, not British businesses. China benefits. The Chinese Communist Party benefits. And Starmer is implementing exactly that policy. Green energy forcing us to buy Chinese products. Net zero destroying British industry, while China builds coal plants every week. This isn't incompetence, this is ideological alignment. A man who spent his career sympathising with communist causes now implements policies that benefit the world's largest communist state at Britain's expense. Here's the final piece. When Kemi asked what the trip achieved for human rights, for Jimmy Lai, for Uyghurs, for stopping cyber attacks, the answer was nothing. But that's not because Starmer failed to negotiate. It's because he never tried. You don't spend 80 minutes with Xi, double the scheduled time, laughing and smiling, and fail to bring up a British citizen in prison unless you chose not to. You don't visit a country committing genocide and come back without mentioning it unless you chose not to. Starmer's silence on Chinese human rights wasn't a failure. It was a choice. A choice not to confront the Communist Party about anything uncomfortable. A choice that makes perfect sense when you understand he's spent his life sympathising with regimes like this. Kemi ended with this. Britain is a great trading nation. Of course we should engage with other countries, even hostile ones. But we need to do so with our eyes open and from a position of strength. And that requires a Prime Minister who puts our national interest first. Eyes open. Position of strength. National interest first. Starmer fails every test. His eyes aren't open because ideologically he doesn't see China as a threat. He doesn't negotiate from strength because he gives things away to causes he sympathises with. He doesn't put national interest first because his career has been about ideology first. When Kemi called him virtually a communist, she wasn't insulting him. She was diagnosing him, explaining why his China policy makes no sense from a British perspective, but perfect sense from an ideological one. And that's terrifying because this won't get better. Every future China interaction will follow the same pattern. Britain gives, China takes. Starmer smiles. Our country gets weaker because the man leading us doesn't see China as the threat it is. He sees it as an ideological cousin, and you can't stand up to someone you sympathise with. So here's where we are. The British Prime Minister spent his life in socialist and communist circles. He did a deal with the Chinese Communist Party where he gave them a spy embassy and got nothing. He refused to confront them about human rights, about British citizens in Chinese prisons, about supporting Russia's war. And when his opposition leader called him virtually a communist, he had no answer. No denial, no defence, just silence. Subscribe and share this everywhere because the media is burying this, but people need to know who's running Britain. Comment communist if you see what Kemi exposed. In 23 days, there's a by-election. His MPs have admitted they'll lose. And when that happens, the pressure on this communist sympathiser Prime Minister becomes unbearable, and we're documenting every second of his collapse.